For more than 200 years, when you thought of Sweden, you probably thought of one thing: neutrality. I mean, it was at the very core of their national identity. It's the policy that kept them out of 2 world wars and the Cold War. But in 2024, well, everything changed. So we're going to dig into this incredible story of how a country can totally reinvent itself, from this powerhouse empire to a peaceful welfare state, and now a full-blown member of a military alliance.
All right, so let's get right into it, because this really is a fascinating puzzle. I mean, think about it. How does a country, one that spent centuries building its entire identity around peace and staying out of conflicts, suddenly decide to just throw away a 200-year-old policy? It's a huge deal. And to really get the answer, we've got to go back and look at 3 key chapters in Sweden's story.
And believe it or not, our story doesn't start with peace and quiet. Nope, it starts with the exact opposite: empire. Long before Sweden was known for being neutral, it was a massive, dominant military power in Europe.
So if you look at this timeline, you can see this incredibly fast rise, and then a really dramatic fall. After they broke away from this Danish-led union with King Gustav Vasa, Sweden just went on an expansion spree for the next 100 years. By the mid-1600s, they were a certified European powerhouse. But all those imperial dreams came to a pretty spectacular end in 1721, thanks to a huge defeat in the Great Northern War.
In Sweden, they call this period Stormaktstiden, which literally means the Great Power Era. And what's so wild about this time is just how much they controlled. In the 17th century, Sweden basically ran the Baltic region. And you have to understand, that was where Europe got all its vital stuff: grain, iron, timber. So if you controlled the Baltic, you had a ton of leverage over the whole continent.
So you can imagine, losing all of that was a massive national trauma. I mean, they were defeated by a whole coalition of countries, including Russia, and it plunged them into this huge identity crisis. Their days as a great power were just over. The country was forced to look inward and ask itself, okay, so what do we now? And that crushing defeat is what set the stage for a total transformation.
And that brings us to the next chapter. Because out of the ashes of that empire, Sweden built something completely different. Something brand new. A peaceful, progressive welfare state. An idea the whole world would eventually come to know as the Swedish Model. So after their very last war back in 1814, Sweden made a choice. They adopted this policy of staying non-aligned in peacetime and neutral in wartime. And that decision, it gave them over 200 years of straight, unbroken peace. Just think about that. 2 centuries with no war. And that time allowed them to focus all their energy on building their country from the inside.
Okay, and at the heart of this new Sweden was a really powerful idea: Folkhemmet, which translates to the people's home. This was the big vision, mostly pushed by the Social Democrats. It wasn't about choosing between capitalism or socialism. It was about finding a middle way. The basic idea was, let's run our country like a good home, like a family, where everyone chips in and everyone is looked after. No one gets left behind.
And you can really hear that philosophy in these words from Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson, who is pretty much the main architect of this whole idea. And this wasn't just some nice-sounding speech. No, this was a blueprint for a whole new kind of society. The goal was to get rid of the old class system and build something new, something based on equality and everyone helping each other out.
And here's how they actually made that vision a reality. The government built this incredible safety net that provided security for people from, cradle to grave. We're talking universal health care, free education, social security, the whole deal. And this didn't just happen by magic. It was all paid for by a model based on high taxes, really strong unions, and this shared idea that everyone was in it together for the common good. This was the people's home in action. And for decades, this model, this peaceful, neutral, welfare state, it seemed totally solid, unshakable even. But as we entered the 21st century, things started happening on the outside that began to put pressure on this whole idea. Sweden was about to be forced to face the end of a 200-year-old tradition. So here's the conflict in a nutshell. On one side, you've got this policy of neutrality that's been part of Sweden's DNA for 200 years. And on the other side, you have a brand new, much more aggressive reality in Europe. Suddenly, the math that had worked so well for Sweden for so long just didn't add up anymore.
Now, we have to be clear about something. Sweden's neutrality was never this pure, absolute thing. It was always more of a practical strategy. For example, during the Cold War, they were secretly cooperating on defense with NATO and the West. See, the goal was always a practical one: stay out of a war. It wasn't about being totally isolated for ideological reasons.
And this timeline right here, it really shows you just how fast everything changed at the end. When Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014, that was a huge wake-up call for Sweden. But the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that was the final shockwave that just shattered the whole status quo. And just a few months later, in a move that would have been unthinkable before, both Sweden and Finland officially applied to join NATO.
And that brings us to the final chapter of this story. This is the culmination of that long, long journey. And it's the beginning of something totally new for Sweden's role on the world stage.
Okay, take a look at this map, because it shows you just how big of a deal this is from a strategic point of view. With both Finland and now Sweden in the alliance, the Baltic Sea, which has always been a really contested area, is now almost entirely bordered by NATO countries. Some experts have even started calling it a NATO lake.
And then, on March 7, 2024, it was a done deal. After a pretty long and, let's be honest, sometimes rocky approval process, Sweden officially became the 32nd member of NATO. And just like that, more than 200 years of military non-alignment came to an end.
So, that brings us back to where we started. We've seen Sweden's journey, from empire to this neutral people's home, and now to a member of a military alliance. Their long peace didn't end because they were invaded. It ended because they made a choice. And that raises some really big new questions, right? How does a country famous for being a moral superpower and a peacekeeper fit into a military alliance? How will they balance paying for more defense with keeping that social contract of the people's home? Their old identity is gone. Which leaves us with the big question. In this new era, what will Sweden become?